Thank you very much, Emily. Good evening. Inspiring talks before that. Let me say that the first question that people ask about my mid-career change from IT person to writer is, how did you manage to move from information technology to a creative field? And I notice only the tiniest titter from the audience, so I presume there aren't a lot of information technology people here who just feel suitably put down. But putting aside that question for a moment, what I'd like to talk about tonight, very much in the spirit of the original TED, is how I moved from a career in technology, specifically as a specialist in data modelling, which is, broadly speaking, and I will not talk at length about this tonight, which is broadly speaking database specification, to a career in entertainment, writing a romantic comedy screenplay and associated novel via generalised design theory. So you're in for a heavy night in case you hadn't worked that out, okay? So I am so jealous at the moment of my friend Marcus Lovett, who's in the audience tonight, because his midlife career change, well, his career change a little earlier in life, was from gymnast to aerial skier. And I sort of figure that would give you a lot more exciting visuals to be working for. But tonight we are going to work with what we've got, which is so if there's anybody out there in the audience tonight who's an information technologist who wants to be a writer, I'm your man. This is going to be really useful, okay? But for the rest of you, perhaps, well, you might have seen that TED video at the beginning of tonight before we started with the subtitles. That was Ken Robinson. And one of the things that Ken said was creativity comes out of cross-disciplinary thinking. So that is certainly going to be one of the themes tonight, how creativity can come out of moving from one discipline to another, what the value of that is. But the third thing is I would like you to think, as I speak tonight, about this fairly radical change I made in career, just what sort of, where you could take your own skills, where you could use what you know in a different field. And I think particularly tonight, Tom said, find what you love and do it. Chantel and Viv talked about doing really worthy things. But let me say, for all of those, it's better to go into those fields not just with love and with good intentions, but with some brains and expertise. And the longer you've studied and the longer you've worked, the more it seems reasonable to leverage what you've got rather than simply start from scratch with good intentions. So tonight is very much about thinking, what can I do with what I've currently got? So, first the database specification, the data modelling stuff. I will make this as brief as I can. I worked for 25 years doing data modelling, and I gained a certain amount of expertise in that field and also a certain amount of business process redesign. They were both, in my view, hard, creative work, with emphasis on the word creative. Except that the received wisdom, what they taught at this very university, was that data modelling was not creative work. Even though it felt like creative to me, I had been told it was not creative. It was essentially an analysis job, a bit like a pathologist working out what's in the blood. I mean, it's hard work, but it's not creative. There's an answer, you get the answer, you tell somebody what the answer is, it's not creative. So when I decided, for reasons I won't go into tonight, that I wanted to be a screenwriter instead of a data modeler and business process re-engineer, there was a little bit of unfinished business in my life. I really wanted to know whether the work I had felt was creative was indeed creative. So I did the obvious thing and enrolled in a 4-year PhD at the University of Melbourne to ask the question, that's how I felt afterwards, to ask the question, is data modeling a design discipline? In other words, is it a creative discipline like architecture or product design or software engineering? And I spent 4 years trying to answer that question, and my reference discipline was something called generic design theory or design thinking. And this is an umbrella discipline which sits over the top of all design disciplines, be it, again, architecture, engineering, bridge design, product design, all those things. Says, look, this is a body of knowledge which is relevant to design no matter what sort of design you're doing. It's a body of knowledge that's been developed since the 1960s. It's got quite a big following, a lot of books, all those sorts of things. So my question was, does data modeling fit under this umbrella? Is it a design discipline? And after 4 years, the answer was yes, and I walked off to do... Thank you, Melbourne University, for your support. So I walked off to my selection interview for the undergraduate screenwriting program at RMIT, straight out of a PhD. And the first question they asked me pretty much was, Graeme, at the age of 50, is there anything you've learnt in your past life which might be relevant to being a screenwriter? And of course, the obvious answers to give was, I'd learnt to work in a team, I'd learnt to communicate well, I'd learnt to solve problems. But at that moment, I had one of those light bulb moments, and instead of saying that, I said, you know what? I reckon a data model, a database specification, is a lot like a screenplay. and I said, you know, because, I mean, both of them are not something that you see out there in the world. They're just a component, a template for something bigger to be built on top of it. The database specification builds the database as an application all around it. What people really see is the screens and so on, not the actual database. And in the same way, a screenplay, of course, has all the, you know, the filming and the actors and all that sort of stuff on top. So it's sort of the same, isn't it? And I have no idea what they made of that answer. But they were good enough to let me into the course at RMIT at screenwriting, and a seed had been planted. And I asked myself, I wonder, having stretched the bounds of design theory to incorporate data modelling, which is really on the science or analysis side, could I stretch it over here and include screenwriting, which is more on the art side? Could I treat screenwriting as design? Now, if you haven't been a screenwriter, this might sound a little unpromising, but if you've watched Hollywood films, think of the word formulaic, okay? Formulaic means that Hollywood films tend to follow a fairly consistent structure. And in fact, in the late 1970s, Sid Field wrote a definitive book called Screenplay, and which looked at the structure of Hollywood movies and found that they fell into some pretty predictable structures and obeyed an enormous number of sort of standard rules, like if you want to feel sympathy for somebody, that person has to appear on the screen in the first 10 minutes or you won't care about them, those sorts of things. And later workers in the field have identified, for example, Blake Snyder identifies 15 different plot points in a typical screenplay, from catalyst through to all is lost, and so forth. I mean, there's a formula happening here, and it gets more formulaic if you talk about particular film genres, such as horror or, say, romantic comedy. In romantic comedy, you have the cute meet, where the two potential lovers meet and hate each other at the beginning. But things move on, and of course they get together, they split up. There's a moment where they split up, all is lost. Then there is the rush to the altar, all those things, 15 standard steps. And design theory says, design problems, I'm going to be quoting Brian Lawson, design theorist. All quotes tonight, Brian Lawson, design theorist. Brian Lawson says, design problems are structured hierarchically, meaning we have the script, the acts, the sequences, the scenes, the shots. That was good enough for me. It's got to be design. Okay? So what I decided was I was going to try to consciously apply design theory that I'd learned to my screenwriting. Now, it wasn't as though I wasn't being taught a whole bunch of stuff already in theory of screenwriting, but a lot of it was contradictory, a lot of it was fragmented, a lot of it was just anecdotal. It was what one teacher believed. It works for me, so it'll probably work for you guys. And as I say, a lot of it was contradictory. And I thought, well, okay, when in doubt, I will refer back to my body of knowledge called design theory. Let me make this concrete and practical for you. One general design principle is design is never finished. Unlike investigation, for example, where you get the results of the blood test, you say there's the answer, a design can always be made better. Okay, so my screenplay could always be improved. Well, around the time I was in the course, Australia had a visit from the head of screenwriting at the Danish National Film School, a guy called Mogens... Surname escapes me for the moment. I'm going to rip him down, so it's probably a good thing that I forget it for the moment. But he came to the country and he was quoted as saying, if it takes more than 3 months, you've spent too long on it. And if it takes you a year, you're just bad. And a bunch of people around me, in the face of some contradictory views from screenwriters, a bunch of people around me started to take that on board and saying, we race through it 3 months, if it's not done, we throw it away, and so on. I just rejected that advice immediately and completely. It didn't go with my design theory, and I just kept plugging away, which turned out to be a good thing because I was a pretty slow worker and I was learning as I was going. Number 2, principle. Design solutions create new design problems. Which is to say, when you're designing something, you say, I can fix that. Oh no, that means I've got to fix this. But that's just part of the process of design. So when I'm thinking, my protagonist needs to be more powerful, more active. My solution to that is I'll make him be the one to ask the love interest for the second date instead of her. That creates a problem because he doesn't know where she lives at this stage. So he could find out where she lives. That creates a problem because there's some humour that's going to come off from him not getting mistaken about where she comes from, and so on and so forth. But I just keep going. Another problem pops up, knock it down. One pops up, you knock it down, boom, boom, boom. And eventually you've knocked down all the problems. That's how design works. But around me, screenwriters say, that solution won't work. It creates another problem. It just creates another problem. No, that's okay. And thirdly, designers do not work top-down or bottom-up. They do both. They work top-down and bottom-up at the same time. So when we are doing the cards, which is a standard screenwriting technique, you lay out each scene on a card, and then you shuffle them around on the board. And designers work in that sort of graphic way too, so that was natural. You're knocking them around the board to change the sequence, and someone will say, hey, I've got an idea. In that 17th scene, I've got a great line that could open it. And someone will say, hey, we're working top down at the moment. Save it for later. Wrong answer. Don't save it for later. Turn the card over, write it down, do some workshopping on where that scene might go. By the way, note workshopping, design is a collaborative activity. That goes scribbled on the back of the card, etc., etc. Now, look, there was nothing I was doing that wasn't out there in some screenwriting theorist's handbook. But design theory gave me something reasonably coherent. And also, it was more than that. It wasn't just that I had an alternative or additional bucket of theory to draw on that other people didn't have. This is probably the most critical thing I'm going to say tonight. I had experience with that. The point was I had experience using that body of theory, even if it was designing databases, okay, or doing business process redesign. I was like a jazz musician who's only played clarinet, but he moves to saxophone or to piano. Doesn't matter, there's still an awful lot you can take across, even though it looks like you're doing something entirely different. And I found that I was comfortable. Moving those cards around was so like business process redesign. So like just moving to different places and so on. So in the end, I wrote the screenplay. It took me 5 years for that's the 10,000 hours. I think I had a head start on the 10,000 hours that Malcolm Gladwell talks about you needing for expertise. I had that head start from my database work, believe it or not. But 5 years later, I had a screenplay for the Rosie Project. Halfway through, I had to face the fact that sometimes solutions to design problems are often holistic solutions, which is a polite way of saying I threw the whole thing in the bin. And the only thing I pulled out of that bin was what the design theorists would call the primary generator. The single thing that was most important to that screenplay, which was my hero, Don Tillman, the socially challenged genetics professor from the University of Melbourne. And I pulled Uncle Don out of the bin. I built a new screenplay around him, and I think, as Emily said in the introduction, I have had a fair degree of success with that screenplay. But now we move to the most interesting part of the story, which is I decided to write the story as a book, as a novel. Not in my wildest dreams would I have ever said that novel writing fitted under design theory. That was a bridge too far. But I started off with characters, with plot, with bits of dialogue, with structure that had all come out of design theory. It took me only 7 weeks to write the book that won the Premier's Award, and 5 years to write the screenplay it was based on. Using design theory, okay? Not done yet. Not done yet. So, what now? I had to admit that the book had in effect been written using design theory. Second novel, what do? You do what works for you. And I now write my novels and my stories using a lot of ideas I've borrowed from screenplay, which came to me via data modelling through design theory. And I do that work in a culture which rejects that approach. Novel writing is seen as a solo activity. You wait for the muse. People ask me things like, novel writing, do you have a special place to write? Nobody ever asked me that when I was doing data modelling. They said, get to work. And I have not only been able to help myself, but I've been able to help others. I've helped others who get stuck with story. Novelists who can write a beautiful 2,000 words, get stuck with the size and stories. Why not use the cards? Isn't that screenwriting? Yes, we will use that to get stories. So in many ways, the biggest career transition with the most cultural difference has been from screenwriting to the novel writing. Okay, we're nearing the end, so what can we take away from this? Well, one, this design theory stuff is pretty good. You can stretch it a long way. Secondly, though, if your expertise is in some other field, think about generalising it. How high up can you take it? Can you call it something like problem solving or performance optimisation or changing attitudes? And can you then take it somewhere else with all those same skills that you've got? And I would just say, finally, if you're one of those people who's more comfortable staying in their game, which is fine too with their expertise, welcome those people who come from outside, because they may well bring something new to your approach. And you may well find, and Marcus, the skier, the Olympic skier, is the expert on this, that it's actually easier to teach a gymnast to ski than it is to teach a skier to do somersaults. Thanks very much.